Most people will say, oh, we don't really eat ultra-processed food in our house.
Oh, don't worry, I have that in clinic. People come into me and I'm like, show me your food diary. It's something like 60% of their diet. Because there's so many things that are marketed as healthy. You've got constant emulsifiers, loads of preservatives, rapeseed oils. This is what our bodies are metabolizing.
The things that are marketed as healthy are quite often the biggest culprits.
More women are more likely to suffer with an autoimmune disease. Women who eat most ultra-processed food have a 50% higher risk of depression.
We assume that women just were born to suffer with these conditions. We don't ask, why have women got all these autoimmune conditions more than men? Why are twice as many women depressed as men? We may not be looking at that missing piece of the puzzle, which is, what are you eating?
Writer and women's health advocate Milli Hill joins us to expose the truth
about ultra-processed food, the female body, and the gut hormone connection no one's talking about.
Know that there is a part of the gut microbiome that regulates estrogen and that needs us to be eating fibre. So if we're eating a lot of ultra-processed food, we're not going to be getting that fibre. The estrobolome is controlling all kinds of things, from our gut health to our estrogen levels and also our mental health.
And so that is a subset of gut bacteria that metabolizes estrogen, which is really important. Are women more vulnerable biologically to men? How does ultra-processed foods play a role in some of these conditions that women suffer with? Maybe we are blaming ourselves hormonally when actually we haven't been looking at what we've been eating. Firstly, I want to say thank you to tuning in and listening to the show. It means a huge amount. And connecting with all of you is something that I absolutely love as part of this journey of growing the show. One of my biggest goals of 2025 is doubling the reach of this show. And I can't do that without your support. So I would love to ask you a favor. If you can press subscribe or follow on whichever platform you listen to. This helps us reach more people. And for me, elevating women in science is so fundamental and ethical and scientific information. So if you feel the show empowers you and gives you the information that you've been seeking, I would love to ask a favor in return and to hit that subscribe button and help me reach the goal that I've set for the show of 2025. Thank you. I'm so excited to have this conversation because women's health is very close to my heart. Being a women's scientist, nutritionist, hosting this podcast, in the last kind of year, I've realized that the more content we've put out on women's health, the more virality we get. But the reason is because it's shown the demand is there, that people are really, really searching for answers on women's health. And I'm really excited today because recently, about a year ago, we had Chris Van Taliken on about ultra-processed people. And last year, that was one of our highest grossing episodes. And so I'm very excited to bring this context to specifically women and women's health and everything in general. So I just want to start with a few stats. So the average UK diet includes almost 60% of ultra-processed foods compared to just 15% in France. When we look at where we are in the UK compared to other parts in Europe. And then I also found this stat quite interesting. Eating just 4 servings of ultra-processed foods a day was linked with an increased risk of early death. And I was like, well, okay, that's large. And I know that 2/3 of our shopping baskets in the UK are full of ultra-processed foods. So we've got a pretty big starting ground here. So then I thought, well, let's just strip it all the way back. That's currently where we are. If we are what we eat, what happens when most of us eat what isn't real?
Well, exactly. Yeah. We have a problem. Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. I mean, you just have to look around and talk to people, I think, to see that we have a problem at the moment with what people are eating.
Yeah. Well, I think maybe let's start with why this is so specific, more so to you, to women, because people will probably be listening to this saying, well, I know there is a huge problem with ultra-processed foods. Why are you focusing this specifically on women's health?
Well, because I think, the question, what about women, needs to be asked all the time. It needs to be uppermost in people's minds all the time because, it doesn't get asked often enough. Often we generalise and we talk about people. And often when we generalise and talk about people, we're referring to the default person, which is a male. So from research to, our own concept of a human, often the default person is male. And so I just feel it's important to turn the spotlight on women and ask how it affects us. We're 51% of the population and we are unique. Our bodies are different. So there's going to be specific impacts on women. So yeah, it's women's bodies matter.
Yeah, no, they do. I think what I found so surprising about this is, I mean, there's a massive amount of research in this book. And you speak about how ultra-processed foods can contribute to things like menopause, to depression, to autoimmune diseases, to dementia, to chronic insomnia. And interestingly, women score higher in these diseases anyway. Women are more likely to have an autoimmune condition. More women are more likely to suffer with an autoimmune disease. More women are more likely to suffer with depression. So how does ultra-processed foods play a role in some of these conditions that women suffer with?
Well, that's a really interesting point that you've made. And the other thing that interests me when it comes to women's health is how often we assume that women just were born to suffer, if you like. We were born to suffer these conditions. We don't ask why. Like, why have women got all these autoimmune conditions more than men? Why are twice as many women depressed as men? We don't know the answers to these things, really. And so with food, it's like suddenly you think it turns on a light bulb because you think maybe this could be part of the answer. Obviously, it's not 100% of the answer and it's complicated, but it's staring us in the face, this sort of balance, isn't there, between, is it because of what we're eating? So is it something in the ultra-processed foods that's causing problems in the body? For example, inflammation or some other strange response. Or is it because when we're filling ourselves up with ultra-processed foods, we're not filling ourselves up with all of these whole foods and fibres that we're supposed to be eating as humans, that we were built and have always eaten up until about 50 years ago?
So something that like spikes my thought here, and I will take these down like level by level, talking about menopause, talking about mental health, talking about PCOS. But one thing I think that really highlights when I think about women is hormones. So are women more vulnerable biologically, did you feel, when you were researching this book, to men? And maybe that's why ultra-processed foods are having such an impact?
I think, well, there is obviously so much we don't understand. For example, the microbiome is such an emerging area of health. I know you've recently had someone on your podcast talking about how there's a difference between the female microbiome and the male microbiome. But we don't really know very much about that yet at all. But we do know that there is a part of the gut microbiome, for example, that regulates estrogen, and that part of the gut microbiome needs us to be eating fibre. So if we're eating a lot of ultra-processed food, for example, we're not going to be getting that fibre. And so then our estrobolome, as it's called.
I'm so glad you said that because I just pulled it up and I was like, Millie will say this way better than I can.
Yeah.
But yeah.
In the book, I refer to it as the sea witch because for some reason it gives me this image of this kind of mysterious creature deep in our gut microbiome. But the sea witch, the estrobolome, is controlling all kinds of things from our gut health to our estrogen levels in our body, our regulation of our estrogen levels. And those in turn, for example, could have an impact on our vaginal microbiome and also on our mental health. So it's really, really complicated.
Well, it's all interconnected. And I think that's the thing in the body. So can you just describe what that word was again for people that have maybe have never heard of it?
Yeah, the estrobolome.
And so that is a subset of gut bacteria that metabolizes estrogen, which is really important and critical for hormone health, especially for women.
Yeah, men have one too, by the way. It's not a uniquely female thing.
Wow, okay. But it's something that is very, we've done a lot of gut health episodes on this and very rarely has that come up.
Yeah.
And I imagine obviously that maybe declines as you age into menopause. I'm just thinking because you have a drop in estrogen, so maybe that's also another determining factor. If that's not being supported by food and then you're going through menopause, I can imagine that also being quite a critical insurance factor to think about.
Well, I think the differences in the male and female microbiome come into play at puberty and then even out again a bit more at menopause. What role the estrobolome plays in all that and how that changes, I'm not sure, but I do know that it's definitely really important to be eating a lot of fibre and whole foods when you're going through menopause, and that is probably the reason why. I think we can safely say it's the regulation of estrogen in our bodies. There's never been a better time really than menopause to be starting to think about what you're eating in terms of how it's affecting, your estrogen.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, you said in the subsec 5 questions, when I asked you the question on health transformation, And I said, what's one health related change that significantly impacted your well-being? And you actually were like, well, I'm going to answer two. And your first answer was your diet, making much more focus on your diet. And obviously as a nutritionist and somebody who is very empowering around food and wanting people to try and make the right choices for their health, how has food become so fundamental to you in this journey, especially through menopause, which you spoke to me about earlier?
Yeah, well, basically, I mean, that's how I came to start thinking about this book, because I was actually working on another book, which hasn't come out yet. But when I was working on that book, I was writing something about menopause, and I was going through my own experience of menopause. And I had a sort of game-changing moment where I Googled, how do women around the world experience menopause? And I hadn't really thought about this before, because we never do think about these things before they happen to us, do we really? Let's face it. So, and that was really eye-opening for me, because I started to read that there are women in other parts of the world who have a very different experience of menopause. Some cultures don't have a word for menopause. Some don't have as many hot flushes or as we do. And some cultures also conceptualize menopause differently. So they think of it as, an upgrade where a woman becomes a wise woman, or, a second spring.
That's such a positive version of a menopause,
Yeah. And I think in cultures that perceive older women as important, then there has been some research that has shown that women in those cultures have less menopause symptoms. So it's almost as if part of the menopause symptoms could be psychologically connected to feeling that your value has dropped. But I mean, that's speculation, but I think it's that when I read that, I thought that's actually really interesting. And it made me think about my own perception of myself and how the psychological aspect of how you feel in midlife could be not the whole picture, but part of the picture. But certainly as well, this idea that, for example, women in Okinawa, who are eating a lot of plants, have a much better experience of menopause generally than we do in the West. And that got me thinking about diet. So then when I read Chris Van Tulleken books, that was another reason why I wanted to put the spotlight onto women, because I thought this could be really game-changing for women. Again, because the female body is sort of pathologized and medicalized so readily, we may not be looking at that missing piece of the puzzle, which is, what are you eating? Which is so simple really compared to lots of the other options.
And that was definitely my journey into this. And I don't believe it's the only resource that we need, but I mean, it's interesting when I look back, because I'm writing my book at the moment, when I look back at the last 10 years of my change of career, when I'd lost my health and everything was kind of at a standstill with myself, my first step forward was into food. For me, it was the first graspable thing where I was like, okay, this I think is really important. Biochemically, physiologically, everything in my body, from my brain to my immune system, I was like, I actually need to figure out that what I'm putting into my body is going to support me in all these different ways. And it is sad that 2/3 of our shopping baskets are full of processed foods. And I think this is the conversation that I have and I struggle with, where we talk a lot about choice, but I kind of feel that we are in such an obesogenic environment that actually our choice is so reduced, because when you walk into a supermarket, you have more processed foods and ultra processed foods than fresh foods. Whereas when I go on holiday and I go into little markets, wherever I am, whether it's Italy or Spain or France, it feels so much more abundant. The fruit, the vegetables, everything just looks so much more nourishing and fresh, and it just tastes better. And so I find it easier to make those choices than when I live here in the UK or when I go to America.
Yeah. I mean, in France, they've protected bread. They have a thing called the décret pain, which is like the bread decree, which has made rules about what can be in bread, and that it must be sold on the premises where it's made. So they don't have, I expect they do in their supermarkets now, but generally the bread in France is not UPF, most of the bread. And that's a huge area, right there, that's solved by by legislation.
Yeah.
The other really interesting thing I think about, with the stats you're giving about how much of our shopping baskets are full of ultra-processed food, and also we should distinguish between processed and ultra-processed.
Yeah, let's just get these graphs up in the book.
It is interesting, though, because when you talk to people about, when I've been talking to people about this book as I've been writing it, most people will say, oh, we don't really eat ultra-processed food in our house.
Oh, don't worry, I have that in clinic. People come into me and I'm like, show me your food diary. And I'm like, how much ultra-processed food do you think you're eating? And they go, I don't know, 20%? It's something like 60% of their diet.
Yeah.
Because there's so many things that are marketed as healthy.
Exactly.
And they're ultra processed.
In fact, yeah, the things that are marketed as healthy are quite often the biggest culprits. I found one in the supermarket the other day. It was a kefir ice cream. So I thought, that's interesting. I've never seen that before. Picked it up and it said, great for gut health and things on the front. Flipped it over and it had about, 6 different emulsifiers and preservatives and thickeners. And
iron is one of the most common deficiencies that I see in clinic, especially in women. And it's not just about feeling tired. Low iron can impact your energy, your focus, your mood, and even your immune system. It's something we really need to be aware of, because if left untreated, iron deficiency can become very serious. Now, UK data shows that around 20 to 35% of women aged 18 to 50 do not meet the recommended dietary guidelines for iron intake. And if you're pregnant, menstruating, or following a vegetarian or vegan diet, your needs are even higher, and therefore you're more at risk. So that's why I often recommend Spartone. Now, this is a naturally sourced iron-rich water that comes from the Welsh Hills. It contains ferrous iron, the most absorbable form, with studies showing up to 40% absorption. So your body can actually use what it takes in. Now, it's also incredibly gentle. It's one natural ingredient, there's no harsh tablets, and there's no digestive issues. I use it myself, and it is my go-to in clinic. You can pick up Spartone at Boots, and if you've been feeling low on energy, it's absolutely worth checking in on your iron with your doctor or GP.
You've got these like beef super noodles, which most people would probably think, oh wait, maybe we should use Tesco wholemeal bread. When I was with Chris, I actually bought these items in and we were descripting them on the back. But you can see, I'm gonna put this up to the camera so on YouTube you can have a look. But there's a big old long list of words on this. And I kind of think about when I would make homemade sour bread at home, not that I do that all the time, I might do that once a year, but it's only a couple of ingredients. And then you look at this and you've got things, constant emulsifiers, loads of preservatives, rapeseed oils. I mean, it's huge, like absorbic acid. Well, actually that's vitamin C, but lots of yeast extracts, flavor enhancers, lots of thickeners. And so actually, this is what our bodies are metabolizing. They're not getting it. And what I call it is overnourished, but under eating.
yes. Well, I think that's happening with children is, growth problems, because they may be eating a lot of food, but they're actually malnourished, even though they're eating a lot. And extraordinary and terrifying thing to contemplate, really. Because the other thing that the writing the book got me thinking about is that you can actually eat a lot of things. It's what they call hyperpalatable as well, which means it's like the Pringles slogan. Once you pop, you can't stop.
Yeah, it's because one of the, I remember at school someone telling me, because there was an E number in there that literally activates a part of your brain to keep you going. So I was like, that is why when you pop, you can't stop.
Yeah, I mean, they're just so Moorish. I mean,
Yeah.
It's that Moorish nature of UPF that's
I know, they are good,
really
aren't
grabbing
they?
us. Yeah, well, they are good. And I think that's really important to say that, because we need to have a conversation where people are honest. Like we were saying, all of us are eating this stuff. All of us are tempted by this stuff. And so it's no good sort of splitting ourselves off and saying, oh, we're this holy folk who have this amazingly pure diet. I don't want to put myself on that pedestal and say that I am that person, because I'm not. I've got 3 children. We have a normal family house where, we do sometimes have things like sliced bread that we've just been talking about. It's very difficult to get away from it, but there are small changes that we can make that will make a big difference still.
Well, I think the one thing that's really going to shock people here is, this is labelled as healthy, by the way, but I don't normally call brands out, but it's in your book, so I'm going to do it. Activia Gut Health Low-Fat Yogurt and Granola. So tell me, I'm going to put this up again to the camera. So this is the label of ingredients. So talk to me about this, because maybe this is where we start, because most people would say that's healthy, I think, listening to the show.
Yeah.
Tell me your take on this. Now I've shown the ingredients to everybody.
All of these products are being marketed for profit. So they have extra ingredients in them to make them more Moorish, more hyperpalatable, to have a longer shelf life, to be more appealing. Often they're maybe full of sugar, or they may have sort of gums and emulsifiers in them to make them creamier, but they don't have cream in them to make them creamier. So there's all of these tricks, basically, that are put into that yogurt to make it cheaper to produce, last longer on the shelf, easier to transport, reliable so that every single Activia yogurt that you open is the same as the other one, which is actually, if you make things at home yourself, you know, is not how things normally work in your home kitchen. So all of these elements are all for profit, when really you don't need any of that stuff. If you want to eat yogurt, you can just eat natural yogurt with fruit, and then you're fine.
I think that whole low-fat era, I'm hoping it's dying out now a little bit. I mean, it's definitely more key towards women, which I think is probably interesting to say. I think more women are naturally lean towards low-fat products, but if you remove the fat, you remove the flavour. So obviously this is the reason why they become so bulked out with these stabilisers and thickeners.
Yeah.
To give them that, and the sweetness, to give them that
but also
moreish behaviour.
Yeah,
exactly.
It's cheaper. Yeah, I mean, did you know that Diet Coke and Coke Zero are basically the same product, but that they created Coke Zero to appeal to men because they thought that Diet Coke sounded more appealing to women? I mean, that tells you so much, doesn't it, about the food industry and about how women are marketed to.
Yeah, well, I always love the term that if you take the T off diet, you get die.
Yeah.
And it's a huge undernourishment. I think that's what I worry with the rise of ultra-processed food. So we still haven't defined them. So let's define processed versus ultra-processed. What's the difference for people who are trying to navigate this in a supermarket?
Okay, so human beings have always processed food, at least for as long as we know about. So if you take an apple and chop it up or cook it into cooked apple, you're putting it through a process. If you cook a piece of fish, you're putting it through a process. So there's nothing really wrong with processed food. A jar of chutney or a loaf of bread is all food that's processed. It's been through a process. Ultra-processed food is something different. If you flip it over, it will have ingredients on the back that you don't recognise. That's one of the key ways that you can tell. There are apps you can get as well, I should probably mention. There's one called Open Food Facts. So you can scan the barcode and it will give you a little sort of traffic light system to tell you if food's ultra-processed or not. But it's pretty easy to tell if it's wrapped in plastic and it's in the supermarket. It's likely, you know, the best thing to do is just assume everything is ultra-processed and start there.
Well, it's true, you know, that Activia, I guess people would be like, oh, this is something that's really good for my health. There's lots of Activia shots. The big thing that I see is healthy bars that are labelled as protein bars that are hugely ultra-processed. Lots of shakes are ultra-processed. Yeah. And so I think there's this mass market because the wellness industry is about to be $8 trillion in 2026. And I think because that is such a big market and there is so much money to be made, everyone now is trying to pinpoint what they're selling into health. But sadly, half of it isn't.
Exactly. And I think that food companies are going to get cleverer with what they're putting on their labels, because that message has been going around for a while now of flip over the packet and read it if you can't recognise some of the ingredients. So I think that we need to watch out for that, because I think that will definitely happen, that they call it clean labelling. And I think to some extent, to be fair to food companies, it may be that they want to make a move towards reducing the level of ultra-processing. But on the other hand, you know, being cynical, it could well be that they just want to, they want you to put that product in your trolley anyway. I think there is the other thing that does get a bit confusing, just to say, with this idea of it having ingredients that you don't have in your kitchen, is that sometimes, like say a tin of kidney beans will have one thing in it, like a firming agent. And I see a lot of this in like Facebook groups about ultra-processed food and discussions of people getting really into a sort of panic about what they can put in their trolley and what they can't. And it's fine. If you want to be a complete purist, then you need to seek out that tin of kidney beans that's just tinned beans in water, or you need to buy your beans dried and soak them, that kind of thing. But I think if you can still recognise the item as food, that's another good sign that it's probably not been ultra-processed. I mean, the kidney bean still looks like a kidney bean, doesn't it? Whereas when you've got your sort of strange bars, like my favourite, my nemesis, the Go-Ahead fruit and oat bake, which I let my kids eat a lot of, and I don't anymore, because I just thought, oh great, it's like a kind of health, just go ahead, it's healthy. those sorts of items that have got like 35 different ingredients, it's you have to have some nuance when you approach this topic. But it is the case that women are quite often in charge of the shopping and the cooking. And so if you are that woman who's also trying to work and juggle loads of other aspects of your life, it does make it very difficult for you if you then feel that every single thing that has an extra ingredient on the back can't go in the trolley. So there has to be some nuance introduced so that people can navigate this and keep their sanity.
I do think the overthinking part and the stress of it is also something that is really important to touch upon. But I do think that the education around the other choices is really important. I think people are so confused, and I see it. I work in this every day in the nutrition landscape, and I can see people are so confused because it has got confusing. But actually, without me wanting to sound degrading in any way, it is quite basic. We're just making it more complex than it needs to be.
Yeah, I think some of the confusion is coming from food companies. It's in their interests for people to be confused. So I do see news articles, for example, that muddle up, and even information pages on websites of people companies who should know better, muddling that sort of process with ultra processed and making it all sound really complicated. So I think some of it is coming from food companies. But like you say, it's obvious, really. If we're all really honest with ourselves, we know what actual food is. If your grandmother, if it would have been in the shop when your grandmother went to get the food for the week or whatever, then it's less likely to be, an egg, an apple, a potato, a piece of meat.
Rice, all of that type of
exactly.
stuff. It's very rare that I would talk about companies on here. But I do think it's important to talk about things. And it's because this is very dedicated to women, such as Weight Watchers. And I've always had a bit of my back's always got up about Weight Watchers and Slimming World and these companies, because I think, yes, the community aspect is amazing, but it's registered on the NHS as a great weight loss treatment. And what worries me is that they're selling their products through these meetings. And I think the meetings is what gives support to people being able to lose weight, because we know when we do things in a community and we share our vulnerabilities and we feel that support, then we can actually get much further with weight loss. But the problem that worries me is that it's then about buying these products, and these products are laden with all of these ultra processed foods, with these gums, with these sweeteners. It's all about points. It's all about like extreme diets, and they're all nutrient deficient. And it worries me that even the NHS is giving that as a support mechanism for weight loss, as opposed to trying to get people to eat more foods that are full of fiber, that are going to fill them up, satisfy them, and allow that community support aspect to still be there, but not selling products that are all ultra processed.
Yes, exactly. And I mean, there's still the messaging, from places like the NHS about having smaller plates, and it's all very reductive. It's ignoring the elephant in the room, I think, which is that if you have a great big plate full of freshly made salads and whole foods, then you're fine. It is the ultra processed food that is the problem. And maybe we just don't want to acknowledge that, because we've painted ourselves into a corner where it's so convenient, or that's what we've been told. And I think that's another interesting myth that's worth challenging, the sort of idea that we can't live without these products, especially in the modern world, because I don't feel like I have loads of extra time because of ultra-processed food. And none of the women or men or any of the adults that I look around and see seem to be benefiting massively from this industry in the way that we're told that we are.
I've watched the science of adaptogens grow personally over the last few years, and I've become more curious in their role in nervous system support, focus, and resilience, because adaptogens basically buffer the cortisol that gives us that stress and anxiety. But here's the thing, quality is everything. Most adaptogens on the market don't actually contain enough of the active compounds that you see in clinical studies to make a difference. That's why I've partnered with London Nootropics. These guys only use clinical studied standardized extracts. This is really, really important to get the benefits that you're seeing in clinical research.
And they work with Hephaestus, Europe's leading mushroom bioscience company.
They have high bioavailability. They use incredible ingredients like KSM66, ashwagandha, and rhodola life. And these are the active ingredients that you need to see the difference. They have lots of different blends. Flow gets me into deep focus with lion's mane. Zen helps support my calm and steady my clarity with ashwagandha. And Mojo gives a clean lift, no crash. And Mush Love made with fantastic fungi with 3 Hephaestus mushrooms to elevate your day. Enjoy 20% off and use code LIVEWELLBEWELL. They come in these fantastic little sachets, and they are great for traveling too.
Well, I think I just want to like bring back in some stats here, because I was reading through your book and I was like, wow, this is actually quite interesting. Menopause symptoms worsen with higher ultra-processed intake, especially hot flushes, mood swings and weight gains. And then alongside that, if we go back to when women are having periods, ultra-processed foods are linked to more painful periods, heavier bleeding and worse PMS symptoms. And so it is having quite a direct impact, maybe on us without even knowing. And maybe we are blaming ourselves hormonally when actually we haven't been looking at what we've been eating.
Exactly. But it's such an easy thing to do as a woman, is just to, one of my chapters is about being unlucky. I think it's called Unlucky Women. We just have this idea that, you say you have really painful periods and I don't. I'm just lucky. Why is that? I had a really easy birth. You had a cesarean. I'm not saying you literally did. I know you haven't.
I haven't got children. Exactly. In case my audience are like, when did you have a baby?
Yeah. For example, women have these conversations. Oh, I was lucky. I could breastfeed. Oh, I was lucky. I had a really easy birth. I was lucky.
That is true. We do use that terminology.
I never have had period pain. I must just be lucky.
They are lucky.
Yeah, but we just assume that it's just like a luck of the draw thing, and that there's nothing we can do about it. And so then we make ourselves powerless. There's only one option, and that's to medicalise. And we're not asking about the role of diet at all. I spoke to so many women when I was writing the book with all kinds of different health conditions, many female-only health conditions, but some that are, experienced by both sexes. And all of them said that it wasn't mentioned when they went, for the first line of help, sort of GP. And that isn't meant to be a criticism of GPs, because I know that we're massively stretched and that there's only so much that can be done. But I do think if we can put that idea into people's minds, GPs, people in authority, but also just women themselves, just to think about it, then that could be a real game changer, because a lot of the time it isn't being mentioned. Even with things like infertility. And I was sitting on the tube coming here, and there was an advert in front of me saying you could buy this IVF package and it's only £2,900 or something. And I was sitting there thinking, wow, that's a lot of money. And I was thinking of all those people who are paying that money for their IVF and wondering whether they were asking what they were eating. The man as well as the woman, obviously, in that case, because it can have a high UPF diet can have an impact on sperm motility and sperm count, but on women as well. But also it can impact on your cycles. So if you don't have a regular cycle, it can be more difficult to know when you're fertile, more difficult to get pregnant. But there's so many things. There wasn't a single area of women's health that I thought about and I thought, right, let's start researching that today, that I didn't find evidence for. Either newer evidence that looked specifically at ultra-processed food, or slightly older evidence that looked at, the role of a sort of Mediterranean diet, that kind of research. Every single health condition I looked at, food was there. And yet all of these people who are struggling with these various aspects of their health are very, very often not having it mentioned to them at all.
And did any of them that mentioned it to you change and go off ultra-processed foods and see a difference?
Yes. I mean, those were the people that got in touch with me, people who had women who had, had that experience and struggled for a long time, and then had sought specific help, for example, from a dietitian, and had then changed their diet. Or there was one woman who stopped eating sugar for Lent. She'd always experienced premenstrual dysphoric disorder.
PMDD.
Yeah. And she'd had a really, really awful time for like over a decade. And then she gave up sugar for Lent, and she didn't get it that month. And she was like, oh, so obviously for her, the sugar was interesting, but also she then changed her diet completely and she fixed the problem for herself. Again, I think it's really important to say that it's not a fix-all for everybody. And I think in a world where women's health problems are often undermined and belittled and sidelined, it's really important that people know that I'm not saying, oh, all you need to do is just change what you're eating and everything's going to be fine. Some women have really ongoing, difficult struggles with things like endometriosis. And I'm not suggesting that all they need to do is just stop eating ultra-processed food and that's going to be a magic wand. But I do think it's something that is very low risk or no risk for women to try. And it might not be the magic wand, but it might make a difference. It could make a difference. And it's, if you try, let's say try it for 3 months. If it doesn't help, fine, email me and tell me.
The way I describe it to people is, if you think about a car and you think about it's a petrol car and you're putting diesel in it, that car is going to break down. Every part in our body, all of our cells need certain nutrients to flourish, to let the enzymes work and to send signals. All of these things are built on a very tight machinery. And the fuel to that machinery is the nutrients and the food. And so if you're putting in the wrong type of nutrients or non-nutrients at all, and we can't even say they're nutrients, very slowly that car starts to break down. But we don't see our bodies in that way. We kind of forget that we are this machine that is built that has to have like the right substance put into it. And I think when we can try and think about it as that car analogy, it allows us to maybe think about the choices before we make them. Whereas I think it's become an autopilot. I was in France the other day and the person I was with stopped in a gas station. And I went in, and this is not saying that, I do eat ultra processed foods and I do have that, but I'm much more conscious because of my job. And I went in and bought some blueberries and some apples and some nuts because I was hungry, and some water. And they went in and got a breakfast bar, a McDonald's, and I can't remember, a packet of crisps or whatever. And it wasn't a judgment, but it was more like, I feel that you might crash having all of that in one go. But the signaling was like, well, this is quite healthy because it's a breakfast bar. And it made me realize that actually it's just because of what we're surrounded by that sometimes we're not always actively thinking like, how much nutrient and nourishment am I getting in that meal?
Yeah, it's very difficult to
really
make those choices because the ultra processed stuff is kind of more tempting and it's easier to eat, but it can be really, really hard to, especially when you're traveling or out and about.
Really hard.
To find stuff that is healthy to eat, that isn't ultra processed. It's really, really difficult.
Yeah. I think that's one of the biggest barriers. I think about this in terms to mental health, which I talk about a lot. And women do have higher rates of depression and anxiety than men. But I do want to state that it is one of the biggest killers for men. In young men anyway, suicide is a very big thing. So it's definitely me not diminishing that men don't suffer with their mental health. But when I read the stat in your book, it was really interesting that women who eat most ultra-processed food have a 50% higher risk of depression just from eating ultra-processed foods.
Yeah, and twice as many women than men have depression, and twice as many women than men have anxiety. And yes, more men die by suicide, but that is because they kill themselves using more violent means. I'm so sorry if this is an upsetting area to discuss. Actually, it's women attempt suicide more than men, but they just are less, I don't want to use the word successful, but that is true. So yeah, women are more depressed, doubly depressed. And we don't know why that is, but we do know that women who are eating, as you say, a diet high in ultra-processed food are much more likely to be depressed. And there was a great trial in Australia where they called the SMILES trial.
Dr. Felice Jack has been on the show.
Oh, she's amazing.
She's amazing.
She is amazing. And I loved listening to her when I was researching. And her trial in Australia was incredible in terms of taking people who were already depressed. And I think 70% of the people in her trial were female. And she took people who were already depressed and half of them changed their diet. And I think she had 30% of them go into remission from depression.
33% into a modified Mediterranean diet.
Yeah, which just shows it's not just about staving off depression. It actually could help people who've actually already got depression.
Well, it takes me to a really interesting point, but women are 30% more likely to be prescribed antidepressants than men, even for the same symptoms. So we're there talking about mental health and depression. The one thing that, and I know GPs are under so much pressure, but thinking about, I do believe medication is needed for a big subset of people. I do think it is an important area. And I sadly think there's too much stigma and shame there. But I also think if we coupled that with food, imagine how better the outcomes could be if we put them on a prescription and also a food prescription.
It doesn't have to be either or in any area of health. Depression, another one is menopause. I'm not opposed to HRT. And in fact, in the research, they've shown improvements in menopause symptoms for women on HRT and women not on HRT. So it's not about polarizing the situation and saying, oh, everyone's just got to ignore their doctor and start eating more salad. It really isn't. Yeah. It can be all done in tandem with conventional medicine. is your stat like is the percentage of the people who go to the GP saying I'm depressed? So it's not that men, because I'm assuming there's also a large cohort of men who never get as far as the
100%.
GP with depression, because there is that stigma, particularly for men, around admitting that you're struggling with your mental health.
Yeah. So one interesting part in there is that you coined this term, the good girl effect.
Right.
And how it impacts how we even talk about pain. And you've mentioned that earlier. But how do you think women, I mean, you were just saying, oh, it's easy for, she's very lucky, I'm not very lucky. Women do seem to have a lot more obstacles, I guess, maybe in health, maybe should I say, than men with periods, menopause, just childbirth. There's a lot of things there. Why do you think that, that effect of being able to deal with pain is still quite stigmatized? We have to just get on with it. How can we kind of break that cycle?
It's really complicated, isn't it? So say, for example, you say women should have leave from work once a month. They should be allowed to have 2 days. You automatically divide people, because some people feel that suggestion is deeply anti-feminist, because for the last 50 years of women wanting to be perceived as equally capable as men in the field of work, the world is built around the male body. The world is built for people to men don't have any of this cyclical nature, do they? They're born, they go along mainly on the straight line, whereas women are always cycling in different ways and going through these different changes. And I think that's an amazing thing about women, actually. I think that's a fascinating thing about women. I mean, we're taught that that's a negative thing. Like, lucky men, they don't have to put up with all this women stuff. But I actually think the female body is fantastically interesting and incredible and well overdue a kind of reframe. And then all women should be thinking about their bodies with a sense of pride rather than a kind of sense of, oh, why me? Why couldn't it be a man and not have to put up with all this stuff?
Well, one of my friends said in relation to that, just while you're on that moment, she said, actually, I feel very privileged to be a woman, because every certain time of the month, I know that I can let everything out and everything becomes looser in me, and I can put my emotions everywhere. And I feel really bad that my boyfriend doesn't really get that. He doesn't really get a reset every month.
Exactly.
And I was that's quite true.
Yeah, it's really interesting, isn't it? The only big change they go through is puberty. And then after that, it's all plain sailing all the way through. So our world is kind of structured around that. Like the world of work, we work 5 days on, 2 days off, don't we? We don't work in a cyclical way. And also the ovulation time for women can be a real superpower in terms of this is when you feel really, you have all your best ideas, you feel really top of your game, you start new things, So if you start to understand your own cycles as a woman, you can structure your work life around it, particularly helpful if you're self-employed, and use those times of the month to either rest and recuperate or to really go for it and work in a more cyclical way. But that's not how the world is structured. So then if you get into a place where you say, oh, well, we should have 2 days off a month for women's to have, a rest if they want to, then that can be perceived as quite anti-feminist, because it's like saying women are weak, women can't compete in the man's world, women need this rest time. It's not perceived that way by everybody, but it does divide people.
Yeah.
So it is complicated to
work that out.
Well, that is something
that is coming up, isn't it? And that is a topic of debate for some people, I think, at the moment, of whether women should be having... I think it's very individual. I think some women who really actually do suffer with endometriosis or very severe problems which is related to their cycle, whether it's PCOS, whatever it is, I think actually similar to taking a mental health day check, I think actually can be really supportive. And I think some women, I also think there's a conversation around some women just feel empowered on their cycle. Even when they're on their bleed on their first day of the month, some women feel great. And I had Dr. Sarah McKay on here. I don't know if you've heard of her. She's a neuroscientist.
Yes, I have. She's amazing.
And she was talking to me a lot about the different kind of cultural observations of PMS and how certain countries have hardly any PMS compared to others. And she was saying it's more of a cultural observation of how we talk about it and how we are labeling this as a thing than others. And I was like, wow, so it's not just biological and it's not just hormonal. And she was like, no. And it really blew my mind having that conversation on, she spoke to me so many times about kind of the advantages and the hopes and all of the great things around menopause and women's health, which left me feeling elated and excited. Whereas a month previous to that, I was in LA at a conference for women, and I left feeling traumatized that the day you hit 35, everything starts to plummet, your brain changes, all of these things happen. And I always remember sitting there going, oh my gosh, I'm not quite sure I'm prepared, and having quite like a terrified response. And actually that communication method, as much as it's amazing that we are communicating so much more about women's health and all the changes that one goes through, the mode that it's communicated in, I think, is really important.
Yes, I think there's always a lot of focus on the negative aspects, even if it's unintentional. And so I find that women absolutely love to hear something positive about their bodies. I mean, I've done a lot of work around pregnancy and childbirth. I've written 2 books about it, and pregnant women want to hear positive birth stories. They want to hear that their bodies are capable of giving birth. It's like they're like a sponge. They love to hear it, and it's the same with menopause. If you take a woman in her 40s or 50s and talk to her about the massive upgrade of menopause and how you are becoming a wise woman and you're kind of graduating into a new and even more epic version of yourself, a lot of women have never had that said to them and don't feel that way. And like you say, and like Dr. Sarah McCain was obviously saying, the psychological aspect is if you tell somebody, what's the book called? This is going to hurt. If you say this is going to hurt, then it's more likely to hurt.
Yeah.
If your expectations are low, then you're likely to find that you meet those expectations.
I think everything is about reframing. I think we're such a negativity bias. Our brains are naturally wired in that way. It's harder to be more positive, but I think it's essential for any change stepping forward into any transformation we're going to go through, especially as women. I feel like we're always transforming.
Yeah. And speaking of reframing, I think a really good reframe around the food thing is thinking about, everyone always says about giving up ultra-processed food. But in the book, I write about how it's interesting to think not of giving up something, but what you're making space for. Because I think there's more to this than food, actually. I think, and this again came to me as I wrote and thought deeply about what food is and what it means to people. We have lost our connection with other humans, and we have lost our connection with nature in the past few decades, as well as this rise in ultra-processed food. And that kind of plastic stuff, plastic packaged food is kind of almost symbolic of all of that. And I think people at the moment are really feeling a need to get back to that basic stuff. If you sit around a campfire, it's the same, isn't it? Sit around a table with friends with some candles and a really nice table full of food. It's not really just about the food. It's about eye contact, seeing each other, laughing together, sharing things, tasting food together, and also food preparation with kids and with family. All of those things are actually really fundamental human activities, and they are all lost if we stop preparing food ourselves. There's something much bigger than food about it all. So I think instead of thinking about giving up ultra-processed food and it being this thing, giving up makes it sound like a bad thing, doesn't it? Like, oh my God, like you were saying with your friend in the service station, I don't get to have that anymore. I just have to have these blueberries, But actually it's bigger than that. And it's about what you're inviting back into your life. And looking at your screen, people say, oh, I don't have enough time to cook. But how many hours a day are we all spending on our devices? We've got to face up to these things. We've got to stop lying to ourselves, I think, about all of this stuff. And the food companies have manipulated us into going, they want us to go, that's a brilliant suggestion for them, isn't it? It's like, oh no, we definitely haven't got enough time to cook. It's definitely much easier to put this thing in the microwave or these chicken nuggets in the oven. That serves them very well, but it doesn't serve us. And it's also depleting us, not just nutritionally, but from that kind of connection to nature and to each other.
Absolutely. So I think people are going to be listening to this and going, okay, Millie, well, tell me some ways to not chuck some chicken nuggets in an oven or to not chuck a soup into a saucepan. That's going to make me feel better. So there's so much research in this book, and we sadly don't have time to go through all of it, but we have really touched upon so many symptoms for women that it affects, and how much abundance there is in the supermarkets of these ultra-processed foods. So what are some easy steps that people can take? and processors, even mental processors, to start including more nourishing foods in our diet that aren't ultra processed?
Yeah, well, start out thinking of it as a positive project rather than a sacrifice, definitely.
Play. Think of play.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think don't sweat the small stuff. Don't be hard on yourself. Don't feel that perfection is the only option, because even small changes can be the beginning of something. And I think even neurologically, that's been shown. You know, there's a really interesting, I spoke to some really interesting researchers in the book about the hippocampus and how ultra-processed food affects the hippocampus. But then that in itself, you know, has a knock-on effect into our behavior and our choices. So we can get stuck in these kind of negative loops. And so one small change, talk about vicious circles, but there's this other concept, isn't there, of virtuous circles.
Yes.
So just by making I just say make small swaps to begin with. So get some fruit in the fruit bowl. So if you want to have a snack, have an apple. Such an amazing thing is an apple, isn't it? Think about bread. That's a really, really good place to start as well. There's a lot of snobbery around supermarket sourdough, sour faux, some people call it. I think that's really unfair because it's helpful if you can get something in the supermarket that's accessible and not too expensive. And who has time to make their own sourdough? I mean, come on.
Do you know there's sourdough hotels in Sweden that people give their the roots of their sourdough in when they go on holiday? That's how cultural it's got over there. I think it's amazing.
Well, I'm not trying to put people off for doing these things, but I think if somebody's feeling really overwhelmed and just starting out on this journey, then there are lots of small things you can do. Think about what you're having for breakfast. You know, culturally, again, we've just been brainwashed into thinking that, you know, boxes of cereal are the only thing to eat for breakfast, or toast with sliced bread.
Yeah, which is no protein. For me as a nutritionist, that's so important to get in at the beginning of the day, like 30 grams of protein in the morning. If you can have some eggs, if you're vegan, it's very different, but tofu, something that you can just get. And eggs can take 5 minutes just to boil. I sometimes do that when I'm doing my makeup.
Yeah. And if you look around different parts of the world, again, it's always interesting to look at other cultures and see what they're doing. Loads of cultures don't have Kellogg's breakfast cereals. No. And lots of cultures eat a variety of ways of having eggs in the morning. So, you know, and many of them eat like what we would like. My youngest child has allergies, and he quite often we call it having supper for breakfast, because he will eat what we had the night before for breakfast. So if we've had like a shepherd's pie, he'll have shepherd's pie for breakfast. And that seems like a lot of people think, oh, that's terrible, shepherd's pie for breakfast. But actually, there's nothing wrong with having a homemade shepherd's pie for breakfast, because he doesn't like the, you know, dairy-free milks and that kind of thing. So, you know, you can think outside of the box completely and stop kind of, you know, being a slave to these ideas that we've all sort of been brainwashed into. But yeah, just start small and start making it into a fun project. You know, you mentioned soup being difficult, but I've written some stuff about soup in the book. I think soup's one of the easiest things in the world to make. If you've got a big saucepan and a stick blender, you can make soup. It's so easy.
No, I think soup's great. My analogy was, how can we not get people to buy the soup and chuck it in a saucepan and actually want to go and make something that's quick and easy?
Yeah, I mean, I think the best thing people can do is just try it for a couple of months and see how it impacts on them. And I think, and also fizzy drinks is another thing. And that is the one thing that there's just literally no excuse for. I mean, it's got nothing to do with cost or convenience or any of the other excuses that we use, or time, for some of the other ultra-processed foods we're eating. Soda is just totally unnecessary to human health, isn't it? So if you can swap that out for water or tea or something different, then that, again, I think once people start making these small swaps and start feeling better, then it becomes a more interesting project, doesn't it? And you think, it's like when you start doing exercise, you know, it's hard to start.
Yeah.
If you've not done any for a long time.
Especially when you stop as well and you've got to get back into it.
Exactly. Yeah. It's really hard.
What's been the biggest change that you've made when it comes to ultra-processed foods? What's been the hardest but most impactful?
I think it's just a mindset thing, like I say. And I think lunches and being out and about, it's made me very much more mindful of that kind of thing. Like not grabbing the packet sandwich. I don't really like sliced bread sandwiches, whereas that used to be a kind of lunch staple with crisps on the side, which I actually wrote about in the book, was an advertising campaign in the 1960s or something, where they encouraged people to have crisps on the side of their sandwich to balance the meal. And you get these ideas and you think, where did I get that from? That I should have a few crisps next to my sandwich. Why do I do that? So just challenging those habits, really. I think it's not been like one particular change. It's just been a general slow questioning of the choices that I'm making and starting to make different choices.
Yeah. I also feel like the word that's coming up to me there, which I also do think is an important point to make, because it's not just habit change, there's nostalgia. Thinking about crisps with my sandwich is quite a nostalgic feeling for me. It's kind of like, oh, wow, that really takes me back to feeling young and at school. And it's that kind of connection that you're also like, oh, that's also why potentially it feels quite comforting. Not just because of the dopamine effects, it's also got this nostalgic side. And I know whenever I feel quite down, I'll cook something that I used to have when I was younger because it makes me feel better.
Yeah.
So there's also those kind of nuances that I think play a massive part in all of these decisions, especially if you grew up in the era that we did.
Sure.
Where ultra-processed foods were coming much more in play.
Yeah. But then we can create comfort foods for our kids as well. We can do that for them, can't we? So that when they're our age and they're thinking, oh, I really want something comforting, they're not going to be thinking about
they go hummus
super noodles
and carrots. So it leads me to my final question, which I ask everybody, which is, Millie, what does Live Well Be Well mean to you?
I think it means just taking your health seriously, and, respecting your body, really. And knowing that you're making an investment for your future by making small changes. You can change your future health as well as your present health.
Yeah, I think that's really great, because I heard an analogy and it's really made me think about health in this way, where we all put money away quite early, potentially in our 20s, or if you're not doing this and you're in your 20s, please start doing this, putting money into a pension.
Yes.
And we're thinking about financially about how we're investing into how we're going to look after ourselves when we're 70 or 80. And I try to get people now to think about health in the same way, of investing time now and their thought processes into what they're putting in their body to how their body is going to be when they're 70 or 80. It's very similar to an investment fund and your pension.
Absolutely good analogy. And we don't want to all just live to be 100, do we? We want
Unless
to
you're Brian Johnson, then he really wants to live till he's 100.
Well, I'd like to live to be 100, but only if I can be
it's the quality
fit
of life
and
isn't
healthy.
it?
I don't want
Yeah.
to live to be 100 if from the age of 75 I can't get up out of my chair.
Yeah.
No thanks.
Yeah. Quality of life.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
So that's important to think about, I think. And the years do whiz by quite quickly. So it will happen. It happens to all of us, doesn't it, getting older? And we'll be glad that we made these changes then, I think. But it also is a really, really positive thing to do for today. It could affect any area of your health that you perhaps haven't even thought about.
Yeah.
Because a lot of people won't have associated what they're eating with their health or their mental health.
Absolutely. Well, everyone listening to this podcast definitely does.
Yes, I'm sure they
Our
all do.
tribe is strong in this. Well, Millie, thank you so much for coming on. Thank you so much for talking about ultra-processed food, especially in relation to women, and all of the kind of nuances that maybe we haven't foreseen. But I think it's such an inspiring book to read. And it's so nice just to see more and more context put on women, really, and support from women. So thank you as a woman to a woman. Thank you for highlighting this and speaking so openly about it. So everyone can buy this on Amazon. It was out on July the 3rd, and we will put the links into the show notes as well.
Okay. Thank you so much for having me. It's been a really interesting chat.
Thank you.